Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and as you can see I'm currently wearing a green dress. The reason I'm wearing a green dress is because I made a bet with some folks on Discord that Donald Trump would win, and he didn't, so I'll be making this video in a green dress. So the person I'm responding to in this video goes on YouTube as Viki1999, and in case you aren't familiar with that user, they're basically a German transgender thoughtslime. And in this video, Viki's going to be making the argument that capitalism is not only bad, that it's immoral, but it's also equivalent to theft, equivalent to stealing. Now, before we begin, I should preface this by providing a quick explanation of what capitalism exactly is. Capitalism is distinguished by two main features: private ownership and voluntary transactions. Those are the two main characteristics that are essential to capitalism. Now, the reason we need to explain this from the onset is that more often than not, I've noticed that Marxists have no fucking idea what capitalism is, and when they argue against capitalism, more often than not, they'll try and blame capitalism for shit that has nothing to do with capitalism. So anytime you're making a video where you're arguing with a Marxist or a Marxist is criticizing capitalism, it is important from the onset just to establish that here's what capitalism is. Anything that doesn't entail this is not capitalism, just from the onset.
Hello everybody, in this video I will tell you why I think that capitalism is bad and why it has to be replaced. There are many ways to approach this.
Yes, and they're all equally stupid.
Of them is equality.
Alright, so to understand this point, we first have to discuss what equality actually means, because it's kind of a vague term that can mean any number of things. So usually when Marxists invoke the concept of equality, they're talking about equality of wealth. Their criticism of capitalism is that there's an unequal distribution of wealth. And well, yeah, there is, because some people work harder, some people are more productive, some people are better at meeting the needs of others, and of course that means that they're going to have more wealth than other people. I mean, that's just a natural part of the system. However, there is one type of equality that capitalism definitely does excel on, and in my opinion, more than any other political system, and that is equality of opportunity. You see, under an ideal capitalist system, I say ideal capitalist system because that's not exactly what we have right now. In fact, I think even Viki's going to point that out fairly shortly, but in an ideal capitalist system, there's more or less equal opportunity for everybody. You know, if you work hard enough, if you're productive enough, you can basically do whatever you want, earn as much money as you want, and so in the sense of wealth, the amount of wealth people have, and yeah, maybe inequality is a natural part of capitalism, but you know, alternatively, in terms of opportunities, one's ability to further their interests and further their goals and amass wealth, then yeah, actually that, in my opinion, capitalism is the ultimate form of equality in that regard.
Capitalism is very efficient when it comes to creating a lot of wealth. Unfortunately, it's very bad at distributing that wealth.
So notice how Viki makes the claim that capitalism is good at creating wealth, but not good at distributing it. Well, the problem here is that you have to consider how exactly is wealth created in capitalism. And this is something that Marxists never seem to take into account. They seem to have this idea that wealth is just conjured up out of the ether. In a capitalist society, and again, an ideal capitalist society where there's no bailouts or subsidies, people obtain wealth, people generate wealth because they're able to meet needs that other people have, and they're able to do it efficiently. So what this essentially creates is an incentive where if you are contributing to society, if you're meeting people's needs, then you're rewarded with wealth that is created by that. So the problem here is Viki's trying to act like the economy, creating wealth and distributing wealth, are somehow separate activities from each other, and the truth is that they're actually the one and the same. You know, generating wealth is distributing wealth.
Pretty much all of the value the economy generates only benefits the top few % of the population, that being their major shareholders.
So in economics we call this the zero-sum fallacy. Basically it's the assumption that anytime someone gains wealth, it must necessarily be at the expense of somebody else. Now, in the types of systems that Viki advocates for, like socialism, then yeah, that's kind of the case. The reason people gain wealth under socialism is because it was taken from somebody else. Not so under capitalism. Under capitalism, typically, when the economy is more productive, when more wealth is being generated, the rich and poor both benefit from that. Yes, the wealthy are getting wealthier, but so are the poor, and the quality of life of the poor has always increased along with that wealth, and we've seen that things that were once considered luxuries for the rich, like refrigerators, cars, computers, basically everyone can afford now. Now, of course, I do think there is a legitimate point to be made that the wealth gap is too wide, that the difference between the wealth that the rich and poor have is too wide, but people tend to blame that on the free market. Like the market creates this dramatic, unfair wealth distribution, and actually that's largely due to government. Government creates regulations that make it harder for working class people to get jobs, and the government gives bailouts and subsidies to big businesses like Amazon. Amazon gets all these free goodies from the government, and it's no wonder that the amount of wealth that Mr. Bezos has dwarfs anyone in the working class. So 2 points to take away here. One is that, the rich are getting richer, but so are the poor. The poor typically benefit from this as well. And even though I kind of agree the wealth gap is way too wide as it currently exists, that's largely due to government intervention, not in spite of it.
Another approach would be wasted time. Capitalism actually doesn't produce as much stuff as it needs to produce. It makes way more, like up to 40% more. The reason for that is complicated. I have a video on that if you're interested. But take it that we all could work a whole lot less with the same pay if we stopped overproducing quite as much.
So I admittedly haven't watched that video that she's referring to, so I'm not entirely certain what her arguments are as to why capitalism tends to overproduce or be inefficient in this regard. But one thing I will say is that, sure, maybe even if capitalism has a tendency to overproduce a little bit, let's take it for granted and say that it does. Socialism, the types of shit that Viki wants, has a tendency to underproduce because there's no market signals when everything's centralized, no transformation problem and all that. So you know what? Even if it's true that capitalism has a tendency to overproduce, I'd much rather have overproduction than underproduction because overproduction, you have more than you need, everybody's happy. Underproduction, some people are going to get hosed. So in my opinion, even if capitalism isn't 100% efficient, if it does at least err on the side of everybody having their needs satisfied, I still consider that a better system.
Next is that capitalism isn't good at distribution of resources. In Europe and America there is millions of tons of food waste every year, while 8 million people starve each year. And yeah, I can blame that on capitalism. I have a whole video on that as well.
So I can't say with any degree of certainty what goes on in other countries in this regard, but I do know here in the United States we have a huge issue with farming subsidies. Farms get a fuck ton of subsidies and a fuck ton of money from the government to basically overproduce. And this results in a lot of wasted food. As a matter of fact, sometimes the USDA will even just outright buy food just for the sake of throwing it away. The reason they do this is to artificially make food more expensive. So it kind of baffles my mind when Marxists and socialists, they'll look at mass starvation in the world and think that big government is what we need to get involved to solve this problem, but they'll never get outraged about stuff like farm subsidies or the government programs that basically pay farmers not to farm or buy food for the sake of throwing it away. They never complain about that stuff. You never hear them bitch about that, but they'll always bitch about that greedy, evil free market.
Next, capitalism promotes oligarchy. Since competition naturally leads towards monopolies.
I hear this argument a lot from people on the left, and it just shows how little they understand about not just even economics, but basic logic. Like, competition causes monopolies. Okay, monopoly. The definition of the word monopoly means lack of competition. So saying competition causes monopolies is like saying floods cause droughts. It's equally stupid. And they never seem to explain how this is the case. They never explain how free markets cause monopolies. Because a lot of times when you see actual monopolies that are out there, like telecom and banking and other examples out there, usually it's propped up by the government. Usually there's regulations that make it harder to compete with them. There's things like patents, which outright the government outright says you have a monopoly. So these people who, again, it kind of with my earlier point, people look at these problems that supposedly the free market causes and bitch about that, but they never complain about these same problems when they're caused by government.
The market always ends up centralizing power among a few people. Those few then have more wealth and power than the rest of the population, which makes it a lot easier for them to bribe politicians or gain unfair advantages.
So when I began this video, I basically mentioned how there's a tendency for Marxists to blame capitalism for shit that has nothing to do with capitalism. I think this has to be a prime example of it. They'll point to lobbying, corruption in government, and they'll say, well, that must be the fault of that no good capitalism. And it's like, no, that has nothing to do with capitalism. Okay, in a capitalist system, capitalism, like I said before, is based on voluntary exchanges and private ownership. When you're lobbying the government to pass regulations that make it harder for people to compete with you, that's involuntary. They're stealing your money to fund guns to point at businesses, whether you agree to it or not. Nothing about that has to do with capitalism. Like, people think that, just because something benefits a business means that it must necessarily have to be capitalism. And that's not necessarily the case. People often use the term corporate socialism to describe, the special treatment that businesses get from government. So don't assume that just because something benefits a business or causes a business to make more money, that is automatically capitalist.
Capitalism is also undemocratic. All of the decisions of what and how to produce and where to sell it and for how much are made mostly centrally by big corporations.
So another common argument you hear from Marxists is that, in all businesses, there's one central person who makes all the decision and nobody else has any input at all. That's not necessarily true. You see, businesses, one of the mistakes that Marxists commonly make is they'll speak of businesses as if there's some kind of monolith, as if these businesses are these uniform entities that all do the same thing, that work the same way, and that's not necessarily accurate. If you look at, businesses can take many different forms. There's different structures that they can take. And some businesses might have a heavily centralized process for making decisions, where one person's in charge. Other businesses might actually structure the decision-making such that it's done by a group of people, or some businesses might even have employee input on how decisions are made. So saying that all businesses have centralized decision-making, that's not necessarily accurate. And this thing that Marxists always advocate for, workers control the means of production, you can have that under capitalism. We call this mutual ownership. All the employees mutually own the business and therefore mutually decide how the business is run. This does happen under capitalism. Now, Viki is correct to point out that this usually isn't the case. It's not as frequent as more central structures of making decisions, but there is a reason for that. Running a business is kind of tricky. It involves a lot of experience, talent, acumen, decision-making abilities that ordinary people typically don't have. So these people who are in these central authority positions within a company, they're usually experienced, they usually have some sort of acumen that other employees there don't have, like they're usually trained on the specifics of economics, of finance, of business management. So even though, yeah, it's true that in a lot of cases businesses do centrally kind of operate, the reason for that is that certain people are just better equipped to make those decisions.
The McDonald's management in the USA decides how much I have to pay for a cheeseburger in Vienna, and I don't have any democratic control over that whatsoever.
Well, yeah, just because you don't personally get to dictate the price that McDonald's sells its burgers for doesn't mean you have no democratic say in our economic system. I mean, maybe you decide that McDonald's sells their burgers for a little too high. Maybe I'd like to buy one for a different price. You can go to Burger King, Wendy's, Arby's, Hardee's, Carl's Jr., Five Guys, Red Robin. There's all different restaurants that serve burgers, right? And by going to a particular restaurant, you're in essence kind of voting for burgers that cost that much. It's a pretty democratic system based on choice. And I don't know what you're expecting. Like, do you think that restaurants shouldn't only be allowed to charge a price that all their customers agree upon? Like, that wouldn't be extremely cumbersome and impractical to implement? Like, what are you expecting? Like, how do you think this shit's gonna work?
And all of those thoughts so far are just the obvious ones, which I don't have to explain further. Now we come to the more interesting one. Capitalism is just employers legally stealing from employees.
Oh boy, we've reached a part of the video where he goes full brainlet.
Let me elaborate on that. This is a production process. This guy has a machine which takes in raw materials and outputs a product. But it has to be operated by someone, and since this guy isn't gonna do it himself, he hires someone. Let's add some numbers. Our resources have a price of, let's say, 50, plus another 50 for rent and electricity, as well as part of the initial cost of purchasing the machine. The worker works it and produces a product that has a value of 200. The employer then gives the employee 50 as a payment. Big deal, right? That's how it works. That's not what theft is. Dislike.
I feel like we need a refresher on the definition of theft. I mean, I've explained it time and time again when I've been debunking the argument that taxation isn't theft, but I think especially these morons who argue that employers are stealing from their employees somehow is theft. It's just bonkers, and here's why. Theft is, by definition, taking someone else's property without their consent. That's the definition. If the employer agrees to the arrangement, if the employee agrees to the arrangement, then it's not theft. Nothing wrong is happening there. If the employer is forcing the employee to work for them against their will, or if the employee is going into the business with a gun saying, hire me or else, then you have a problem. If that's not the case, though, it's not theft, and you need to shut your bitch ass up.
Okay, wait a second. Let's look at that work process again. We had 100 in initial costs. Then the worker worked and we had a value of 200. Using basic maths, that leads me to conclude that the work the worker produced had a value of 100, because that's how much value he added to the product. So looking at the return and investment chart, it looks like this. The employer invested 150, of which 50 went to the worker and the rest went towards upkeep and raw materials. In return, he got a finished product with a value of 200.
Yeah, the employer made more money off of the employee than he was paying the employee. Hence why he hired the employee in the first place. If the employer was going to hemorrhage money by hiring that employee, he wouldn't have hired them. I don't understand why this is rocket science.
The worker, on the other hand, invested 100 worth of labor and received 50 in payment. So one of them got more than they invested and one got less.
Actually, they both benefited from the arrangement. The employer benefited because he turned a profit. The employee benefited because they earned money that they wouldn't have had otherwise. You see, this is something that Marxists seem to have a hard time understanding for some reason. In an economic transaction, both sides benefit. Both sides get more out of it than they had before. If that were not the case, then the transaction wouldn't have happened. If the employer felt like he was not going to get more out of hiring the employee than not hiring him, he wouldn't have hired them. If the employee didn't feel like he was going to get more out of the job than the time he was putting in was worth, he wouldn't have done it. So that's in every economic transaction, both sides benefit. I mean, I don't know why that's difficult to understand.
And if we keep going, we'll realize that all of the profit this guy makes is value he didn't pay his employees.
This is so fucking stupid. Like, fucking 5-year-olds could explain to you why it is that businesses have to make more money than they spend. And you know what I always thought was weird? For some reason, when Marxists and leftists go on about workers' rights, everyone who works for a business is deserving of these rights, except the business owner. And any right that these people clamor on for, non-discrimination, minimum wage, safe working conditions, this applies to all the workers except the business owner. Well, why? Doesn't he also work for the business? Doesn't he deserve to get paid for the time he puts in? If a business owner had to pay each of their employees enough so that there's no profit for the business owner to make, well, first of all, there's no way that business could grow or invest in new equipment, so they may end up not being able to hire new people, so that would end up screwing over even more workers. But it would also mean that the business owner's not making any money. Well, aren't they people too? Don't they have their own bills to pay? Because when people clamor on about the minimum wage, they're like, employees have all these expenses to make and they can't make them. It's like, well, if the business owner isn't allowed to turn a profit, what the fuck do you think that's going to do to him? Does he not have bills? Does he not have a family to feed? Does he not have all these same struggles that the workers have?
Now, you may say, okay, maybe it's stealing, but...
So, once again, if the employee agreed to the arrangement, if the employer agreed to the arrangement, there's no stealing, theft, or wrongdoing of any kind.
It's not like there's a better system. And if that's your response, I hereby give you the homework to come up with a better system and tell me how it would work in the comments.
Here's the thing to think about here, Viki. If in capitalism, because again, the only rule is voluntary interactions, everything has to be voluntary, there's nothing saying you can't try a different sort of system on a small scale. Like I mentioned before, that you can have businesses that are mutually owned and operated by all the workers. That does happen under capitalism. But, even stuff like co-ops and communes, you could buy some land under a capitalist country and start your own little commune within it where everyone agrees to kind of share everything and divide the labor evenly. You can do that. There's nothing saying you can't do that. It's like, here's what I think is kind of ironic about capitalism, is that it's pretty open to other things. So even if you say you're not a big fan of capitalism, but you want to have your own little socialist enclave, you can do that within capitalism. But if people who prefer capitalism want to start a capitalist enclave within a socialist country, more often than not, there's no way for them to do that. So with capitalism, everybody's happy. With socialists, best case scenario, only socialists are happy, and I would argue oftentimes even they're not happy.
Or maybe you're saying, no, you are wrong because you skipped over some detail in order to save time and keep the video short.
Actually, there's quite a few details you skipped over. Probably the biggest one I can think of is in that scenario painted earlier with the machine operator. Where did the employer get that machine to provide to that employee to do his job? Because here's the thing: with that, Marxists often make a big deal about, without the workers, the employer can't make his money. True, but without the employer, the employees oftentimes can't make their money because think about where did that machine come from? In fact, Viki himself admits that the owner has to pay for the maintenance and cost of that machine. The employee doesn't have to do that. The employee just works the machine. So, it's not like, so they often act like capital comes out of people's asses. Like the person who owns a factory just stumbled upon it, and all the people who work for him weren't just lucky the way he was. It's like, here's the other thing these people don't consider when they use this argument. Most business owners, most people who own businesses, before they started their own business, they were an employee at somebody else's business. And at the business that they own now, there's very much a possibility that one of their employees that work for them might even go on to start their own business. So this idea that business owners are just these people who lucked out into the higher caste of capitalism, and the employees are just these lowlifes who are utterly, hopelessly dependent, it's just nonsense. It's just, these people don't even know like the basics of economics and business management. It really is ridiculous.
And if you say that, please keep in mind that even without stealing, capitalism is still unequal, wasting time, letting people starve, promoting corruption, and undemocratic.
Yeah, and you know what? Socialism probably has all of those same qualities times 20. This has been Philosophy, making stupidity play dead. And even though I had to wear this green dress for the bet, it's very comfortable, I will say that.